This house back here on the water, yeah, I'm pretty sure they got a tax break.
This family? Yeah, they're getting a tax break.
Hi, and welcome to Maine Challenge. This week, we're going to tackle the issue of taxes, the things we can't live with and we can't live without. I'm excited to have with us as our guest, Sarah Austin, who is the tax and budget analyst for the Maine Center for Economic Policy, which this is an interesting side note. I helped to found that organization many, many years ago because we were desperate for some facts and figures. And the Maine Center has become one of the premier organizations in the state doing economic analysis and what's going to happen with our tax dollars and with our state budget. And Sarah is the guru who helps guide them in all of that. So I'm very happy to have you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to say, funny story is when I first started as an advocate in Maine back in 1983, probably before you were born, I was working for the Maine Women's Lobby, and the first thing that they had me testify on was tax indexing. And the voters had voted on a way of doing tax indexing that was going to bankrupt the state, so the legislators had to overturn what the voters did. So I got up to testify on behalf of the Maine Women's Lobby, and the first question I got was, what the hell is the Maine Women's Lobby doing talking about taxes? Because they didn't think that was a subject for women. So I am very happy to have two women talking turkey about taxes right here. So Sarah, again, it's often awesome to have you. So when we talk about taxes, there's never usually any positive conversation about taxes in the real world, not among policy people. But when you talk about taxes, most people are like, I can't stand them. Most people don't distinguish between sales tax and income tax and excise tax. It just feels like it's a lot. And I think, probably 20 years ago or with Ronald Reagan, I think is when I first remembered that taxes became the real, that was the issue that was going to drive everything, and yet it's something that, we can't do without. So how do we talk about taxes? How can we get people to care about taxes? Why do you care about taxes? You're doing your whole career around this issue.
I think it's an important question, and you are right that there is a lot of negative talk about taxes, and much of that started with Ronald Reagan and a few decades before that with really concentrated efforts to change public opinion to be more negative about taxes. But I know for myself, for women, taxes are incredibly important for providing not only a better society for all of us, but actual structures for opportunity and advancement for so many women and people of color and everyone really, when you drill down across this country and across the state. My mom, when I was just a baby, was getting out of a divorce with a really bad relationship and had two small kids, needed to go back to school to get an education to be able to have a good job. And things like subsidized loans, food assistance, and healthcare for her kids were critical for making that a reality. And that's something that has paid dividends in my own life and my ability to grow up with a family that had good income. And beyond just these basic issues of subsistence, taxes were also really critical for things like having libraries to take your kids to, free places that are places of like culture and community togetherness and enrichment is also a really important, vital role for taxes to be playing to bring us closer together, especially in times when there's so much driving wedges between us. So for me, taxes are not only about that ladder to economic success, but also about how we can do bigger things together than we can apart.
Yeah.
And taxes are just the tool that gets us there. It's how we pull resources to do that.
I always think about it as like the current modern version of a barn raising. Back in the old days,
Right.
If someone needed to have a house, right, they would get together, everyone would come together and they build it. Or if three houses needed a road, they would all get together and they put the road in. Well, we don't do that now. And so instead we pay taxes, and then we have taxes, pay for the things that we all care about, from, as you said, libraries and higher education to our roads. And, when people are so anti-tax, I would say, how'd you get here today? I drove my car. Well, what'd you drive it on? Because actually that road was paid by taxes. So, and I think that it's, trying to reclaim the narrative about taxes as sort of our ways, as you said, which I loved, is the ways to enhance and build community, is a whole different mind shift. And I think we used to have that, but it's so hard now, Sarah, when we look at taxes in general. And as I said, I don't think many people distinguish between state taxes, but all that. When we hear over and over again that the richest 1% and the richest, the top 10 richest corporations like Amazon and General Dynamics, that pay $0 in taxes, while those of us middle and lower income feel like we're paying 20 and 30% total of taxes. We just feel like there's so many. The injustice of it, I think, feeds that rhetoric about we hate taxes, and not like, oh, I'm paying my fair share, they're paying their fair share, let's all get together. Is that true? What does the tax code look like right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. And there's just been a big effort to not only demonize taxes, but also what they pay for, especially for certain communities, whether it's poor communities or communities of color, to really turn it into this transactional relationship of am I getting exactly out what I'm paying in when it comes to things like taxes. But that has also driven real underfunding over the years. So things like schools aren't as great as they could be. And unfortunately, for some people, that leads them to think, well, maybe I could do better on my own, rather than how do we fix schools and how do we pitch in more to make them what we need them to be for our whole community to have access to that. And the bigger tax code and fixing inequities there is exactly how you solve problems like that and get to that better community-driven collective solution. And here in Maine, we our big taxes at the state level, we have income taxes and sales taxes that make up the majority of resources that we raise here in the state. And then at the local level, property taxes are also a really big tax base. So together, these really drive what our tax structure looks like. And sales and property taxes are things that, everyone needs a house, everyone needs to buy basic goods and necessities. And there's a certain, you can't, just because you make a lot less money than someone else, go out and find somewhere to rent for $200 a month. There's a real ceiling or floor for how much everyone has to pay for housing. So because of that, whether you're buying a house or you're paying property taxes through your landlord who has to pay it on the building you're renting, things like property taxes tax people with low incomes more because they're spending more of their income on housing. Things like the sales tax poor people more because they spend more of their income on durable goods that sales tax are charged on. But when it comes to really wealthy households, they have a lot more savings. So the way to make sure that the tax code is fair is that by making sure that we are using something like the income tax to balance out the ways that sales and property taxes tax low-income families much more. And over many years, we've seen an erosion of Maine's income tax that's charged less of really wealthy households. We've also seen some rollbacks on corporate taxes here in the state. And that comes with the price. It comes with being unable to fund basic things like schools and communities, but also it puts farther and farther off some really big challenges that we have as a state, as how are we really going to invest in climate change and adaptation and the big questions there, and things like how do we really make the investments we need to make to fix our housing stock problems, to make sure that we can get to affordable housing. The inability to really tackle with this question of taxes really puts a lot of things off the table. And that's why I think it's important to be able to have more people engage in this conversation.
And care about it. And I was reading an article that you wrote about, which I thought was a great way to say it. It's like when we're looking at taxes, we have to look at two things. One is equity, how fair is it, and why is the poor person or the middle income person paying way more than the rich people? And that's just a whole conversation I want to talk about in a minute. And the other thing is adequacy, which is collectively, are we paying enough taxes to pay for the things that make us thrive in Maine? And so it's like those two things. And I think with all this pressure, all this political pressure to cut taxes, instead of the sort of language around let's invest in our communities, let's invest, and I think that the resistance to that, is really the belief that it's not fair. So I want to talk about income taxes for a minute, because you said, right, that it's the most progressive, meaning it matches people's income most, right? So, but in Maine, this always bugged me. In Maine, when we get to so people are charged different percentages depending on how much money they make. But in Maine, once you get over making over $50,000, it's the same percentage, right? For whether you make $50,000 or $5 million. Am I right about that?
Yes, it's 50 and change, but yes, that's the case.
So why don't we just add, it seems like once 50 and the guy's making to 20 million, 5 million. Why can't we just add another bracket or two? Wouldn't that bring in more revenue? The higher you pay, so if you're making, let's say if you're making, $2 million, you're going to pay 10%, or, what is that an option?
It is. And there's certainly legislation in the legislature this year that would do just that. And there are a lot of states that do have much more progressive structures than Maine does. We only have 3 different tax rates. And as you mentioned, the top one kicks in fairly low. So really being able to use the income tax code to really target high amounts of income is a smart way to make sure that we have the resources we need without asking too much of those who've already been paying in a lot. Yeah. So that's a really good tool to do that. There are also other techniques that you can use in the income tax code that really target specific kinds of income too, because while the majority of us, we have wages and salaries, and maybe if you're retired, you have pension income or Social Security, the wealthiest households have a lot more varied types of income. And one example of that is capital gains and dividends income from investments in the stock market and other kinds of investments. And there are ways to tax specific kinds of income like that to get at a little bit of the intersection between income and wealth, because things like capital gains is income that is driven because of your wealth, not because of your work. So it's really important to be talking about the income tax, but unfortunately, there's been a lot of efforts to talk about just the top rate of the income tax as the entirety of the tax code, which is just so far from the truth. Yeah. So really being able to dig into how to make that structure one that works and one that is fair is important. But I also think we are seeing a bit of a shift right now, especially at the federal level with the pandemic and the huge response that we've seen and people asking for more investment in their communities, even if it comes with taxing wealthy people, taxing corporations. And I've seen a couple of polls that are saying taxing wealthy people and corporations, even as a separate issue, not even talking about what that's going to pay for, is one of the most popular issues in the country right now.
Which is awesome. But
it is.
But I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like, have you asked that question at any time in the last 30 years or 40 years? And we had said, should wealthy people pay their fair share, or should they pay more, right? I think everybody would have said, except for maybe the few wealthy people, would have said, yes, absolutely. But it's so hard. And I know you work on policy in the legislature. They're so afraid of the political ad that says, Susie Smith voted to raise your taxes, and doesn't matter if it's true or not. So how do we how do we get around that? How do we get or puncture through that sort of old narrative that's really old and tired and doesn't match where people really are?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that works about that kind of messaging is that it just completely collapses taxes into a one-dimensional issue.
Hmm.
And it's important for people who want to advocate on this, but also lawmakers that want to champion these kinds of policies to be able to really distinguish that this is about tax fairness and it's about taxing people with the means to actually contribute more. And there are ways to make that clear by talking about all of the tax breaks that this group has gotten in the past, decade or so, which has been huge. And also, it's really important to talk about where that money is going to go to. There's a lot of government trust that has been building over the last several months as we've seen people feel really good about the direction that the federal government's gone with investing in communities, but there's still a lot of doubt, honestly, about really showing people and voters that the investments that the state will make are important and are going to benefit their community. So being able to be clear about what it means to really invest in childcare throughout the state and what that means, not only for kids and their ability to do well better, but also for people to be able to get back to work and know that their kids are well taken care of. So I think those two pieces are really important about how to add some more dimension and nuance to what taxes are really about.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. And as I said, I think people do flatten that, message and have it all be one. So you said something, and I want to pick up on it. So one of the things that I think this is what really gets people's goat as well, is the whole thing about tax loopholes and tax unfairness. And I know that you've done work on sort of people who take the money that they make. The old theory, the Ronald Reagan theory, was people would have more money and then they would invest it in their businesses and they would, right. And what we know is a lot of it just goes offshore. And, a lot of it goes somewhere and they go put money in Bermuda or Switzerland or, somewhere else. And it's not being reinvested in the community. Is that an issue here in Maine? And can we do something about it?
Yes. So really when we're talking about things like tax havens, like you were just alluding to, these are really low tax places that multinational corporations are able to use to store profits that were earned here or in another country to keep them outside of the tax base so that they don't have to pay taxes on them. And because of the huge nature of corporations, the way that they are typically taxed and the way that they're taxed here in the state of Maine is based on sales into the state. So company like Amazon or Microsoft or even Zoom, they have sales into Maine, even though we wouldn't necessarily call them a Maine company. Yeah. So because of that, they owe corporate income taxes here in the state. And we know that tech companies, big clothing brands, and pharmaceutical companies are some of the biggest offenders for things like tax haven abuse and storing their profits outside of the Maine tax base. So this is absolutely an issue that affects us here in Maine and our ability to fully raise the revenue that corporations fairly owe. And there is legislation in this year that would make sure that corporations aren't able to use the most known tax havens that have been identified from the OECD and other international and organizations that do that kind of analysis to lift up those countries. And it would help to raise anywhere from $10 to $15 million here in the state to really help bolster investments we need to make here.
Wow. And $10 to $15 million could do a lot in terms of the kind of things that we need, for direct care workers, for our schools, for our roads, for our bridges, for broadband, all of that. So So
yeah, I mean, I think it definitely, it's important $15 million can do a lot, especially if you're looking at something that's, targeted social service work or something that is really critical and critical need in that way. You can really establish these kinds of programs with that, but it's also just a really important matter of fairness, because if there are Main Street businesses here in the state of Maine who pay their taxes every year, And they're expected to compete with corporations that are able to get out of paying their taxes every year. Then that's a problem that we all should really care about, even people who are very much concerned with the business community. This is a matter of tax fairness just as much as it is of one of being able to raise revenue that we need.
Yeah, and and I think it's such an important point you made that, this is really about fairness to businesses as well, to the mom and pop stores, to the small businesses that are trying to take off here in Maine, all of that, and the other thing is that so many of us in the middle to low income, we don't have tax attorneys who are spending all their time going through the tax code that's this high, figuring out how we can get out of it. And so we end up paying and they end up getting off scot-free, which again feeds that narrative, I think, of I hate taxes. And I think there's part of that is it's just so unfair. It's so unfair that, Jeff Bezos doesn't pay anything and Amazon doesn't pay anything and I'm paying. So I think that's part of that. But I think the other thing I think that people don't understand, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this, Sarah. So back under Eisenhower, I think, the tax rates were way different than they are now, like way higher.
A lot of this, there's a pretty famous New York Times chart that put some of this analysis into one of the moving pictures. I think they're GIFs. Don't come at me, GIF people. But it shows how the federal tax rates have changed over time from having top rates up to 90% for really wealthy households, which is unthinkable now, to all the way down to where we are now, which is about 30% for high income households. And this has been a trend at the federal level and has also in the past decade or so been a trend here in Maine. The previous administration, Paul LePage, he put through a lot of income tax cuts. He did a couple of waves of these, but on net, when he went out of office, the income tax code was raising about $430 million less a year, which is a huge amount of money. It's about 10% of what the general fund usually is. And there's, on top of that, a repeal of an education surcharge that would have raised about $160 million a year to help fund education. And then in 2017, there was the passage of the huge federal tax cuts for wealthy households as well. And altogether, just looking at, not even looking back to the Eisenhower times, whenever taxes were just so different, just looking at the past decade or so, the top 1% of households in Maine have seen a tax reduction on the federal and state level of about $50,000 a year, that's a salary for someone. So that is a huge amount of money. And as the legislature considers efforts to raise revenue in the coming years, as we think about how do we actually sustain these investments that we care about, that's where we need to go to be recouping those dollars, because it isn't low and middle income households that are still struggling with the economic effects of the pandemic where we should go for that money. It is absolutely the people who we've seen actually get through the pandemic, either doing about as well as they were before, or even some of them better. That's what I'm really concerned about moving forward, knowing what we do now from the trends that we've seen. And then also what that has meant. That hasn't been a huge boon for low and middle income households in Maine to have all of these tax cuts accrue to the top 1%. We've actually still not fully funded education or communities, and we're still struggling to fund things that we all know that really, really matter. So that's my stroll in history lane.
So no, I agree. I really appreciate that, because it feels like, I think some people, we have to get through the narrative. We have to get through the bumper sticker, they're going to raise your taxes, and really talk about that fairness, really talk about what we want investments in our communities, and how do we make that equitable? Because it's so stings, and again, everyone's like, okay, we're all pitching in, we're all doing this together. But I think part of the energy around it is that it feels so unfair, and that the top 1%, and certainly in the presidential race, we saw, the wealth tax, and, saying if you're making a ton of money, you didn't make that money. No one works hard enough to make $20 million a year. Like they're, you just can't do that many hours in a day. And so they're working off of other people's labor, off of tax loopholes, off of things. And it's just getting people to pay their fair share. And if we could cut through that narrative and get people to say, yes, that's really where we are, and get lawmakers, right, to agree that they're willing to have the courage to do that, then I think we could actually get to a place. So just really quickly, where time goes so fast, but if you could just give us a picture of, so if we had a fair tax code and if it looked good, and you were successful in your work, what would that look like? What's the dream that you have about what it looks like going forward that sustains you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is about really strong communities. This is about families and communities having what they need to feel successful and thrive. And I mean, when people aren't struggling to figure out where they're going to live or how they're going to afford basic groceries, then they are actually better able to get to work, do great work, and also participate more in the economy. And businesses thrive under this environment too. So this is really a vision where everyone is doing really well, but without the corporate greed and the really the drive for a lot of wealth at the top, but more about holistic community wellness and just everyone having the resources that they need to be able to live a good life.
Yeah, it doesn't seem such a dramatic or such a radical dream, does it? it's like pretty simple, sort of the American dream 101. And, it's really people being fair. And as you said, everybody wins when everyone pays their fair share. And we can look at other countries, we can look at other places where at least they're closer to that. And we can see that that is actually true. So we have to wrap up, but I'm so grateful for the work that you do every day, Sarah, and the work that the Maine Center does every day to make sure that gives us the tools, the knowledge, the numbers, the research that helps us actually try and break through this narrative to make sure that people can, as you say, live and thrive a good life here in Maine, and that it feels fair and it feels like we're all doing our part for communities. So thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for the work that you do. And thanks to all of you for watching.
This ginormous house here? Yeah, I think they got a tax break.
But it's also just a really important matter of fairness, because if there are Main Street businesses here in the state of Maine who pay their taxes every year, and they're expected to compete with corporations that are able to get out of paying their taxes every year, then that's a problem that we all should really care about, even people who are very much concerned with the business community.